Hello, everyone. I am Angie Jones. As Terry said, I work as an automation engineer at Twitter. I blog about automation techniques at angiejones.tech. So if you're not subscribed, you should subscribe. Pretty cool content, if I can say so myself. And of course, follow me on Twitter at techgirl1908. Today, what I want to talk about is the build that cried broken, or building trust in your continuous integration tests. So before we get started, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what I mean by continuous integration in the process of that. So it starts with development, checking in code to a code repository, and that code being built with the existing code base to create a candidate version of the product. From there, we have automated tests that run to verify if that check-in is okay or not. After the tests are run, a report is then generated and given to whoever wants it, typically the developer, to let them know if all the tests passed, my check-in was good. If they didn't, something's wrong, okay? All of these pieces need to work in perfect harmony. However, that test step is the one that gives people the most problems. Anybody having trouble in the room with their continuous integration process, specifically with the tests breaking all the time? Yes. Okay. Fortunately for you, Aesop, ancient storyteller, left us with some fables. He seemed to know something about continuous integration even way back then. So what I'm going to do is share some of those lessons that he left us and how we can apply them to continuous integration. Okay. The shepherd boy and the wolf, or better known as the boy who cried wolf. So there was this young shepherd boy, and he was responsible for taking care of the sheep, right? So he was a jokester, and he would yell out, "Wolf, wolf." And the village people would come running, and they were in panic, trying to figure out what was going on with the sheep. And the boy would just fall out laughing because he got them, right? And so this happened a couple of times, and they fell for it a couple of times. And then after about the third or fourth time, they realized, okay, this kid is a prankster. So they stopped coming when he called for the wolf. So one day, of course, the wolf really was coming. And he cried out, "Wolf, wolf." And of course, they ignored him. Unfortunately, the wolf got a hold of the sheep and they perished. Okay? Our continuous integration process is becoming just like this shepherd boy. Our tests are crying broken, broken. The developers are running to see what's wrong with them, only to find out that there's nothing wrong with the application. It's the test playing a trick on them, right? So we get to the point where no one is paying attention anymore. The developers are not paying attention. The testers are not paying attention. Automation engineers, how many automation engineers I have in the room? Okay, great. Automation engineers are not paying. No one trusts the tests anymore. This was my life a couple of years ago. And it was not a good place to be in, to constantly develop scripts as part of this continuous integration process and have no one trust them, not even us. I got to a point where a customer actually found, well, it actually was a demo. So we were demoing the product to a potential customer, and something broke on the demo, right? And so of course they got back to the test manager, like, what the heck is going on? The test manager came down on us, what the heck is going on? And said, I thought that we wrote some automated scripts for this before. So we went and looked, and sure enough, we did have automated scripts for them. But they had broken like a couple of weeks ago, and none of us were paying attention because everything is broken over there. Everything is always red. And because we didn't trust it ourselves, We just figured it was our test and not actually a problem, okay? So from that day forward, we needed to get our act together. So I'll tell you how we went about that. The fox and the goat. So there was a fox, and he was walking along a trail, and he got a little thirsty, so he jumped into this well that he saw to quench his thirst. So he began drinking the water. It was delicious, and when he tried to get out, he couldn't. It was too deep. So he tried and he tried for several hours to get out. He couldn't get out, and he had to end up spending the night in this well. Well, the next morning, a goat came along this same trail, and the goat heard some noise from the well. So he goes to the well, and he sees the fox and asks, "What are you doing down there, Mr. Fox?" And the fox says, "Oh, I'm down here drinking the water. It's delicious. You should come and join me." So the goat jumps in, the fox jumps on the goat's back, and the fox jumps out of the well, and now the goat is stuck in the well. The moral of that story is to look before you leap. So a lot of teams, I did a lot of consulting work as well, a lot of teams that I've worked with want to do test automation because that's the cool thing to do. Everyone else is doing it, right? The fox jumped in, so the goat jumped in. And they're not sure why they're doing it. What's your strategy? What's your end goal? Test automation is not an end goal. It's a means to an end, right? So once you figure out what's your strategy and what's your end goal, then you can act accordingly to that, right? So if your end goal is to have automated tests as part of your continuous integration process, then maybe you don't want to automate several tests or tests that are not that valuable, right? So be conscious of what your end goal or your strategy is. The lioness and the vixen. So the lioness and the vixen, these are two mothers, right? And so they went out one beautiful afternoon with their offspring, and as mothers do, they bragged on their children. So the lion talked about how strong and brave her son was, and the vixen talked about how smart and witty her children were. And so at some point, the vixen wanted to one-up the lioness, right? So she says, "Oh yeah, but I feel sorry for you, lioness, because you only have that one child. But when I have my litter, it's plenty of them," right? And so the lioness, she holds her head up very high, and she says, "Yes, it's only one, but it's a lion." The moral of the story is quality over quantity. So do I have any managers in the room? Aha. Okay, so a lot of managers that I work with, they are under the impression that they should automate all the things. That is not the right approach, especially if your end goal is continuous integration, right? So there's a cost to automating these tests. If you want to do continuous integration, you want fast feedback. You want the most valuable tests to be automated so that your developers can get that information. You don't want a lot of low-level tests. Who cares? If this test broke, what are we going to do? What does that mean to us? Do we stop the build? Do we not deploy? Or is it very low level? So make sure that you're not focused on the quantity, how many tests you can automate. They love this metric for some reason and bring it all the way up and everybody's happy, but yet nothing is running, right? The tests are broken. So who cares how many you have if are not of high quality? Now, quality, my automation engineers. The tests that you do automate need to be of high quality. A lot of people talk about flaky tests. I'm sure you've seen some of the sessions today. I would hear people talk about make sure your tests aren't flaky. Not today, but back, when. but I wouldn't hear how do I go about making sure that they're not flaky. So here's just some of the tips that I've picked up and techniques that I use to ensure that my tests aren't flaky. I make sure that I'm using stable identifiers. So we've been talking about this for, how old is Selenium? 13 years? We've been talking about this for a very long time. However, the game is changing. The applications are changing. They're being built with these fancy JavaScript libraries, and the DOM is dynamic. And nowadays, just finding an element by ID is not always enough, right? So you found the element, that was fine, that's not your problem. However, it's changing, it's not visible, blah, 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 blah. So make sure that you are getting stable identifiers, that you're keeping all of this in mind. I have a blog post on my website, angiejones.tech, called Firebug, You're Fired. And I talk about how not to rely just on what Firebug is giving you in this stable state, but think about it dynamically and how you can get a handle to it. Intelligent weighting. So believe it or not, people are still adding weights and sleeps in their code. If you are still sleeping in your code in 2017, it is time to wake up, people. Okay? So you want to do it conditional weights. If you're clicking a button and it takes about 3 seconds for this modal to pop up, instead of waiting 3 seconds, how about we wait until the modal pops up, right? So the reason for that is that time is going to vary, especially when you try to run this across multiple environments and multiple machines. And remember, we want fast feedback. So we don't want to wait 5 seconds for something that typically takes 3 seconds, because the 5 seconds feels really safe, right? How about we just wait as long as we have to? Maybe it'll take 2 seconds and we can speed things up. Doesn't sound like a big deal in one test, but when you have thousands of these tests, that time quickly adds up. Also, I've learned to consult a source of truth. So test data management has been a pain in the butt for a lot of people for quite a long time. There are industry leaders who are focused on this and trying to figure it out, and even they are struggling with this because it varies per application. What I've learned is not to rely on test data state at a given time. So for example, if I were writing a test for some search feature in my application, and I put some test data in the system, so when I search, I know that there's going to be one result back. And I write my test to verify that I get the one result. That works beautifully. Until someone else, a couple of months down the road, for their test, adds something else that might match that query. And so now all of a sudden this test is breaking because they expected one, but now there's two. So instead of relying on assumptions about test data, I now consult a source of truth, which may be a database or a web service. So instead of hard coding that one value, I query that source of truth. This is the database. How many of these should I get back? Database tells me 1. Okay, so I compare it with that. If that happens to change to 2 in a couple of months, that test is still green, still works. And then finally, I use shortcuts. So automating against the UI can be very slow. And remember, one of our goals is fast feedback. I get it. People are delivering us features that are UI features. So as testers, we want to test it on the UI. I totally get that. However, when you look at a test, there are a lot of steps in that test that you are not necessarily testing. You might need to, let's say you wanted to test something like removing a product from a cart. All of the stuff to get the product to the cart is not what I'm testing. So instead of going through the UI, navigating through all of this stuff, finding the product, actually adding it to the cart, blah, 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 before I get to the test piece, should not be done at the UI layer. At least I don't do it there. So I'll use web services, I'll use direct navigation. So I look at the URL in my application, how it changes. If I have unique URLs to get to things, I skip the whole navigation piece. So this makes my test faster and less flaky. story time. The astrologer. So there was an astrologer, very deep guy, right? So he would only come out at night, and he would walk along the streets just gazing at the stars and reading them and predicting the future. And he wouldn't talk to anyone around him. He wouldn't even look at them. So one night he was walking and he was gazing, and he fell into this dark black hole in front of him because he didn't see it. The moral of this story is to pay attention to what's in front of you. So we talked about looking before we leap and making sure that we have our strategy in order. However, let's not just focus on new features and new tests without paying attention to what we've already developed. I see a lot of teams who are valuing new code over existing code. Why are we creating new tests when none of the ones we have here work, right? So we're just piling those on top of a mess, is what I call it. So we had to learn this the hard way. I told you the story about the bug that they found in the demo. So we had to learn to make sure that we were paying attention to what was in front of us. And the way we did that was by creating sprint tasks to monitor those builds. Now, this was not popular then, it's not popular now. Anytime I give this advice to a team that I consult with, they hate me for it. No one wants to monitor these things. It's not a fun job. However, everyone who has taken me at my word and given it a shot has been pleased with the results, okay? This is how we did it. We, every sprint, we would add 2 monitoring, our sprints were 2 weeks, we would add 2 monitoring tasks. And one person, anyone, dev, test, automation, could take the task and assign it to themselves for 1 week. And someone else would take it for the other week of the sprint. And their job for that week was to monitor the builds, okay? So we had, on this particular project, we had 4,000 tests, so it's quite a job to manage them. And like I said, it was in a pretty bad shape. And so this literally took up their entire week to manage all of these continuous integration runs, all right? I have a good friend, his name is Paul Merrill. He's out of North Carolina. He's also an automation guy. And he did a webinar not too long ago. And he was talking to people who were just getting started in automation. And in this webinar, he was telling them that you can go ahead and get started with automation and you can set up your continuous integration. So once you have your very first test, you can add this to the continuous integration. And I'm thinking, what the heck is Paul talking about? Like, Paul is my good friend and we talk about automation a lot and we usually are on the same page, but I just did not agree with this. And so he kept going on and on about it, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. And so I asked the question, like, Paul, do you think that as new people to automation, putting their tests in continuous integration might be a bad idea? Like, maybe this is where all the mistakes are being made. This is where the tests are the most flaky because you're still learning. And so you're losing the developer's trust very early. Paul said, oh, no, that's not what I meant at all. I meant you can add them to the continuous integration, but that continuous integration doesn't necessarily have to be public. So this can be something that they manage themselves. So I was like, wow, like that was like brain, to me. So I was like, okay, wow. Yeah, that's a great idea. How about people manage it themselves? Stop showing people their ugly baby. You have like one good login test and you're trying to show the world. And then once you get to the more complicated things, it starts falling apart. So build trust within yourselves first. Make sure you got this down packed. Make sure you understand what assumptions you're making about your application and address those in your code before showing it out to everyone else. All right. So again, the project that I worked on, a mess. hundreds and hundreds of tests that were failing constantly. So it became a nightmare. When you got that 1 week where you were supposed to monitor the bill, it was horrible. It was dreadful. You didn't know where to begin, right? So you have 100 failures in front of you. Where do I start? What we did was we created a simple MySQL database, had a table in there. These are the columns. We had the time that it ran, the ID of the test, what function it was testing, the result pass or fail, and then what bill. We would keep this for every test that ran, right? And so this made triaging those failures a lot simpler because we added some built-in queries to this. And then you can query it yourself. So for example, maybe you want to see all of the failures that are related to your most critical part of the application, like the shopping cart. Maybe I want to triage those first. Or maybe I want to see the tests that are most likely to fail, meaning they're always failing. These are my most problematic ones. Or better yet, maybe I want to see any failures I have that have never failed before this last bill. Those are probably my bugs, okay? So this made triaging a whole lot simpler. We had a little simple user interface that we built to work with this. The Farmer and the Stork. So there was a farmer, and he was getting ready for the harvest. So he planted all of these seeds for his garden, and there were a flock of crane birds. And the crane would come, and every day they would come and eat the farmer's seeds. And so he would replant, and they would come back. So one day the farmer said, I have something for them. And he set a little trap. Now, the next day, when the crane birds were on their way over to the farm, they saw a stork. And the stork was saying how hungry he was. And so the crane said, oh, come with us. We know where to get free food. Everybody likes free food, right? So the stork went along with them. When they got to the farm, the stork realized, hey, this is not right. This is stealing. I'm not going to partake in this. However, the trap had already been set, and the net caught all of the birds. The farmer went over there, and the stork began to cry and say, oh, Mr. Farmer, I'm so sorry, but I'm not with these people. I came, but I didn't partake. The farmer says, sorry, kiddo. Birds of a feather flock together. Or in other words, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. So as we were working on these tests, we had our 1 week task, and we were working so hard to get the bill back in a good shape. And we were making really good progress, except no one cared. The bill was still red. Like, it didn't matter if we fixed 100 of the 400 that were failing. It's red. So what we decided to do is to separate these out. Okay, we were never going to build trust until we got this to a nice stable shape. And that's not what we wanted. So all of the tests that we could rely on, we moved into one build. Okay, anything that was flaky, we moved into another build. And so that green build, that's the one that the developers can look at. That's the one that they can have trust in. If something goes wrong there, we know that it's not us, it's some change in the application. The red one took Paul's kind of advice and made that private. So this was something that we looked at. And we would work on getting these back into the green build. So this worked really well for us, actually. Anything that we moved to the red build, the unreliable, we called it unstable build. Anything we moved to the unstable, we would make a task for, a ticket. And we would put this in our backlog. In the backlog, this would get prioritized with all of the other feature work that we needed to do and all of the new automation work that we needed to do. This gave the visibility to let our project managers let our managers know that, hey, there's some maintenance work that we need to do. And so they would prioritize those. If it was a critical piece of the application, then it would move up. And we would add these to the sprint, and this would be sprint work that we would work on. Final story, the dog and the hare. So the dog challenged the hare to a race. He thought he was faster. However, the hare was beating him. The dog was able to catch up. And the first time he caught him, the dog bit him like real aggressively, right? And so the hare was like, yo, dude, what are you doing? He's like, oh, my bad, my bad. So they continued on with the race. The dog caught him again. This time, he licked the wound. All right? So they continued the race. The next time he caught him, he bit him again. So the hare is like, yo, I can't trust you. I don't know if you are friend or foe. And that's the situation that we found ourselves in on my team. So we would get the build to a nice green state, right? That one build, and everyone was trusting it again. And then someone would add another flaky test to the darn bill. And so then everyone would get up in arms and upset again about that. So what we realized is that we needed to be much more careful in the way we were automating things. It couldn't be a reactive type of thing. We needed to be proactive about building these quality tests. Of course, there's going to be some junior people on your team. There are going to be new people on your team. And so those people, sometimes we had to put training wheels on them and say, okay, your test, maybe you put it in that red bucket when you check it in. And we'll monitor it and make sure it runs for a couple of times before we move it over. So if they had a track record of pretty much breaking the build, then this was the punishment for them. So how the story ends. So we were able to successfully run our 4,000 automated tests in parallel. And they ran in a nice amount of time, so we got fast feedback. We set a target for ourselves to be less than 1.5% unstable. So that red bucket, we did not let that get out of control. So of the 4,000 tests, that's about 60 tests that we allowed ourselves to be unstable. And we felt pretty good about that because Google's number is 3%, Blakey, so. So if it got over 60, we would stop any new automation. It was supposed to be all hands on deck, like Dev was supposed to help, but of course it was just us helping. But yeah, so we would work on that. We weren't doing anything new. Of course, management didn't like that, but that was the price that we had to pay to make sure that we had reliable tests and we weren't just ignoring the failures. Our main builds were always green unless there was a change with the application. So developers trusted this enough that they could deal with anything that was red in that green bucket, right? So either it would be a bug or it would be an intended change, but the test needed to be updated. So they were cool with that. And then finally, everyone trusted the build for feedback. So we were in our happy place. All right, any questions? Yes, sir.
Have you ever had to deal with a flaky app? That is one that fails intermittently. Maybe it's related to other network load.
Right.
The cause is not isolatable, at least not easily, and there's no resources to get a dev to research something they can't repo.
Right, right. So I have dealt with that before. So we call a flaky test one that on the same code base, it works one time, but it can also fail one time without any changes being made to the code base. However, sometimes it's not the test. Like he's alluding to, sometimes it's the application. I read a really interesting blog, and I can't remember who it was by. I'll try to find out and tweet it out or something. But the blog talked about the tests aren't flaky, the application is. And it was really interesting because with that, they were blaming their test when really, like for example, there was a test that would fail 1 out of every 10 times it ran. And so of course, that's the test. But when they put this in production, about 10% of the users were reporting some issue. So really it wasn't the test at all. The test was actually trying to tell them something, and it was the application. And so with that, we try to collaborate with the developers. And first you have to build this trust so that they know that you know what you're doing. Once you're able to build that trust, you can say, hey, listen, it's not me. This test is good. There's something wrong with the application, and can we work together to debug what's going on?
Do you think you should isolate a test like that?
Yeah, I do. I do. So in a build, not my red build, but maybe something for the developers to monitor, kind of push it on them if they agree to it, or maybe you two can do it together. But I don't want to own it as a problem of mine when I know that it's a bigger problem. So I would like them to look at it as well. So another hand.
Yeah, so at what point do you determine that my red bucket test, it's either been replaced by a better test or it's no longer relevant? At what point do you just pop that off and say, test, it's you, it's not me?
That's a good question. So there's one of my mentors is Richard Bradshaw. He lives in the UK, and he's all about deleting a test, right? And so he's like a Control-A-delete type of dude. And so I'm terrified of like deleting code. Like I don't even want to delete comments, right? And so I listened to him say this, and I found myself in a situation where this test, it wasn't one that I wrote, but it was a very flaky test. And so I took that one on to fix it up. And I spent about a good hour trying to get this test working, and I couldn't. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. And it definitely was the test, right? I heard Richard in my ear saying, delete it, delete it. So I deleted it, and I wrote the test over. I understood the intention enough to rewrite that test. So I spent an hour and I still couldn't fix it. I spent 30 minutes, 28 minutes rewriting the test. And it was much more concise. It was much shorter as far as lines of code, and because it was a valuable test. But yes, I agree with you. There could be tests that are just not that relevant anymore. And so, in Richard's words, you shouldn't be afraid to delete them. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
When you talk like green apple and red apple, right? How do you manage the source code, right? You get somebody to write a code, always variable, it should be in the same depot to test the feature. Then you separate the first questions. I think the two questions are almost same. The first one, like you go to read all the like 3,000 test case to red apple, green apple, right?
Yeah.
Like that 3,000 tests, suite of test sets should be something really teams spend a lot of time to do it, right? How do you categorize and how do you manage it, right? You put it to separate that you miss a lot of coverage, either business scenario or
So we used annotations, and we would just annotate the test as unstable. For anything that we annotated as unstable, the rule was you had to make a task, because we didn't want to forget about this. So you had to make a task in the backlog. Eventually, the Scrum Master or project manager is going to be like, why are all of these tasks in my backlog? And so you let them know, like, because we have a crappy automation suite here, and we need to spend some time on it. So that's how we were able to manage that and not lose anything. All right. I think I'm out of time for questions, but I'll be at the, what is it, CoinOp? I'll be at CoinOp, so if you have any questions, you think of something else, please come and talk to me. If you're not going, then you can find me on Twitter at TechGirl1908, or you can contact me on my website, angiejones.tech. Thanks so much.